Now that we've seen the large literary structure of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, we're in a position to see how the original meaning of this passage is conveyed. We have already seen that on a large scale, Moses' primeval history was intended to validate Israel's exodus and conquest by showing how they were in accordance with the order God had established in the early history of the world. But how did this general purpose show itself in the particular account of chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3? How did Moses connect his ministry to Israel with the creation story? We will explore how Moses did this by looking once again at the three main parts of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. First, we'll look at the dark, chaotic world. Then we'll move to the last section of the ideally ordered world, and finally, we'll return to the middle portion of the passage where God ordered the world. Let's look first at chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, the dark, chaotic world. For our purposes, the most important feature of the first two verses of Genesis is the dramatic tension introduced in verse 2. The manner in which Moses described the dramatic tension between the chaotic world and the Holy Spirit made it clear that he was not only writing about creation, but was also writing about Israel's exodus. On the one hand, you'll recall that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, Moses described the earth as formless, or tohu. On the other hand, he described the Spirit of God as hovering, or in Hebrew, merach hephet. The significance of this scene becomes clear when we look at a passage in which Moses alluded to this dramatic portrait from Genesis. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 10 through 12, Moses used the terminology of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 to draw special attention to the connection between Israel's exodus and the creation account. Listen to what he says in these verses. In a desert land the Lord found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions, the Lord alone led him. No foreign god was with him. These verses are important because they are the only other place where Moses used the terms formless and hovering in all of his writings. In verse 10, the term here translated barren is the Hebrew word tohu, which appears in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 as formless. Also, in verse 11, the term translated hovers is merach hephet, the term used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when the Spirit of God hovers over the deep. Moses put these two terms together in Deuteronomy 32 in order to connect it solidly with Genesis chapter 1. But just how did he use these terms to draw this connection? What did the terms barren and hover mean in Deuteronomy chapter 32? In the first place, Moses applied the term barren to Egypt. In chapter 32, verse 10, we read these words, "In a desert land the Lord found him, in a barren and howling waste." In the second place, Moses used the term hover for God's special presence with Israel, probably the pillar of smoke and fire, as he led the nation toward the promised land. In chapter 32, verses 10 and 11, we read these words, "He guarded him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young." In many respects, we may treat Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 10 through 12 as Moses' commentary on his own work in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It gives us insight into his intention as he wrote the first chapter of Genesis. Deuteronomy 32 helps us understand that Moses saw a parallel situation between the creation and Israel's deliverance from Egypt. Moses wrote that both creation and Israel's deliverance from Egypt involved chaotic, uninhabitable worlds. He also wrote that God moved into the original chaotic world by hovering, much as he hovered over Israel when he delivered them from Egypt. From these parallels between creation and the Exodus, we can see that Moses wrote about the dark, chaotic world not simply to tell Israel about the creation. He also presented God's work at creation as a prototype, a pattern, or a paradigm which explained what God was doing for the nation of Israel in his day. When Moses wrote about God's original work in creation, he did so to show his readers that they had not made a mistake in following him out of Egypt. Instead, the creation account proved how their deliverance from Egypt was a mighty act of God. God was reordering the world by delivering Israel from the chaos of Egypt, like he did in the beginning. God now hovered over Israel like he hovered over the creation in the beginning. Rather than being a mistake, the exodus from Egypt was God at work bringing his desired order back to the world. In a word, Israel's deliverance from Egypt was nothing less than a recreation.